The ballroom was a sea of shimmering gold and white, a scene of manufactured perfection that felt both breathtaking and profoundly suffocating. Hundreds of smiling faces, people I loved and people I barely knew, were watching as I held my new wife, Sarah, in my arms for our first dance. The scent of her perfume, a soft gardenia fragrance, mingled with the expensive aroma of champagne and roses. She was beautiful, an absolute vision in her lace gown, her eyes shining with a pure, unadulterated happiness that I felt I was stealing with every beat of the slow, romantic song. I was the groom, the hero of this fairy tale, and yet, I felt like a complete and utter fraud, a villain masquerading in a well-tailored tuxedo. My smile was an aching, carefully constructed mask. My gaze kept drifting over her shoulder to the head table, where her sister Emily sat. Emily, the maid of honor. Emily, the woman whose face I saw when I closed my eyes at night. It was a sickness, a quiet, obsessive madness I had nurtured for years. Even before I started dating Sarah, I had convinced myself that my love for Sarah was real, that it was enough, that the persistent, gnawing ache I felt for her sister was something I could bury, something that would fade with time and commitment. But now, standing here, swaying to the music under the warm glow of the chandeliers, I knew I had been lying to everyone, most au foul to myself. The commitment, the vows, the public declaration, it had all just amplified the lie. The song was a soft, melodic ballad about eternal love. Sarah rested her head on my shoulder, her body relaxed and trusting in my arms. "I love you so much, Alex," she whispered, her voice filled with the pure, unvarnished emotion of the day. "This is the happiest moment of my life." Her words were a dagger to my heart, each one a testament to the monumental betrayal I was committing. I was a thief, stealing her joy, stealing her future. A wave of self-loathing, so powerful it made me dizzy, washed over me. In that moment, I felt a desperate, selfish need to confess, to shatter the illusion, to make the outside world match the chaos I was feeling inside. I leaned in close, my lips brushing against her ear, intending to whisper the most destructive truth I owned. I knew it was monstrous, a cruel and unforgivable act, but the pressure of the lie was too much to bear. I was weak, and I was about to break the kindest person I had ever known. A small, black lapel microphone, clipped to my tuxedo for the wedding video, went completely forgotten. It was a tiny piece of technology, meant to capture the happy whispers of a groom, but it was live, broadcasting a low-level feed to the room's sound system to ensure the speeches were clear. I didn't know. I didn't think. I just spoke the words that had been poisoning me from the inside out. "I'm still in love with your sister." The whisper was meant for her ears only, a private detonation. But a sudden, sharp squeal of feedback pierced the air as the microphone picked up my voice, amplifying it, twisting it into a grotesque, public announcement. The words echoed through the grand ballroom, stark and horrifying. The romantic music from the band faltered, then died completely. The entire room, all our friends and family, fell into a deep, profound, and immediate silence. I pulled back and saw the look on Sarah's face, the initial confusion melting into dawning, gut-wrenching horror. The mask was off. The fairy tale was over, and I was the one holding the axe. The silence in the ballroom was a physical presence, a crushing weight that descended upon the 200 guests. Every smile was frozen, every glass was suspended mid-air. In that single, horrific moment, the world stopped turning. Sarah's hands, which had been resting on my shoulders, fell away as if I had been electrocuted. She took a staggering step back, her face a canvas of disbelief and a pain so raw, so profound, it felt like I was watching her soul break in real time. Her beautiful, happy eyes, once shining with love for me, were now wide with a devastation that will haunt me for the rest of my life. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she just stared at me, her expression asking a silent, soul-shattering question. Why? The first to react was her father, a big, gentle man who had embraced me like a son just hours before. He was now moving towards the dance floor, his face a thunderous mask of pure, protective fury. His two sons, Sarah's brothers, were right behind him, their intentions clear and violent. My own family was a portrait of paralysis. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, a choked sob escaping. My father stood motionless, his face ashen, looking at me as if I were a complete stranger. Across the room, I saw Emily, her face pale with shock and a dawning, horrified revulsion. This wasn't a secret shared between us. This was my sickness, and I had just made her an unwilling participant in my public self-destruction. It was my best man, Chris, who saved me from a physical beating. He and my father moved to intercept Sarah's family, creating a desperate human barrier between me and their righteous anger. The room erupted. Shouts, gasps, the sound of a woman, Sarah's mother, letting out a raw, grief-stricken wail. The dreamlike wedding reception had devolved into a raw, ugly, public brawl of emotions. I was no longer a groom. I was a pariah, the cause of a cataclysmic event that was unfolding in slow motion. I just stood there, paralyzed in the center of the dance floor, the architect of a ruin so complete it was almost incomprehensible. Chris grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. "We're going. Now," he snarled, his voice a low, furious command. He half-dragged me off the dance floor, away from the scene of my own execution. We didn't take the grand staircase. He navigated me through a swinging door into the chaotic, clattering world of the hotel kitchen. Chefs and waiters stopped and stared as we pushed through, a groom and his best man making a desperate, shameful escape. We exited through a service door into a dark, wet alleyway. The smell of grease and garbage, a fitting perfume for the end of my marriage. The cold, damp air was a shock, but it did nothing to clear the fog of self-loathing in my head. Chris shoved me into the passenger seat of his car and drove away from the Grand Hotel, away from the life I had just spectacularly incinerated. We didn't speak. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers against a light, miserable drizzle that had begun to fall. He took me to a sterile, anonymous hotel near the airport, a place for transients and people with no layover. He checked us in, and we went up to a drab, beige room. He closed the door, and the silence was absolute. I sank onto the edge of the bed, my head in my hands, finally, alone with the full, crushing weight of my actions. Chris just stood there, looking at me not with sympathy, but with a cold, disgusted disbelief. "What have you done, Alex?" he finally asked, his voice a quiet condemnation that was worse than any shout. The next morning, I woke up on top of the covers of the hotel bed, still in my tuxedo. For a blissful, fleeting second, I thought it had all been a nightmare, a grotesque dream fueled by wedding day anxiety. But then the memory of the feedback squeal, the echoed words, and the look on Sarah's face came crashing back, and the reality was a physical weight that pinned me to the bed. I was a husband for less than 6 hours. My phone, which I had turned off, was on the nightstand. I turned it on, and it immediately lit up with a relentless barrage of notifications. Dozens of missed calls from my parents, from Chris Bliss, and hundreds of texts from numbers I didn't recognize, guests, no doubt, expressing their shock, their pity, their disgust. The digital fallout had begun. Chris came back into the room with 2 cups of coffee, his face grim. The conversation we had that morning was brutal. There was no comfort, no coddling. He forced me to confront the monumental selfishness of my actions. "Why, Alex? Why would you do that to her? Why would you go through with it if you felt that way?" he demanded, his voice a mixture of anger and genuine, pained confusion. I confessed everything to him, the whole, sorry, pathetic story. My long, unrequited obsession with Emily, a fantasy I had nurtured in the secret corners of my mind. I told him how I had lied to myself, believing I could suppress it, believing my love for Sarah would be enough to cure me of this sickness. I admitted my cowardice. I had been too afraid to call off the wedding, too weak to face the disappointment of both families, too scared to be alone. So I had walked down the aisle, said the vows, and smiled for the pictures, all while knowing I was a fraud. I had selfishly hoped that the act of getting married would somehow magically fix the broken parts of me. Instead, it had just put me on a public stage, under a spotlight, where my weakness was exposed for the entire world to see. Talking about it, saying the words out loud, made me feel even more pathetic, more loathsome. I had destroyed the life of a wonderful woman because I was too much of a coward to be honest with myself. I knew I couldn't hide in that hotel room forever. I had to face the consequences, as terrifying as they were. My first instinct was to call Sarah, to beg, to plead, to explain. I dialed her number with a trembling hand, but it wasn't her who answered. It was her father. His voice was cold, flat, and full of a quiet, deadly rage. "You will not speak to her," he said, each word a chip of ice. "You will not call this number again. You will not go near our house. If you do, I promise you, you will regret it. Consider yourself lucky that all you have to deal with is shame." The line went dead. The door to her family, to any chance of explaining myself, was slammed shut and bolted. My final call was to my own parents. The shame I felt talking to them was a physical, burning sensation. My mother cried, her sobs filled with a mixture of grief for me and profound embarrassment for what I had done to the family's name. My father's disappointment was a quiet, heavy thing that was almost worse than anger. "We raised you to be a better man than this, Alex," he said, and I had no response. He was right. In the space of one evening, I had managed to alienate my wife, her entire family, and my own. I had become an island of my own making, surrounded by a sea of righteous anger and deserved condemnation. For nearly a week, I was a ghost, haunting the beige hotel room, surviving on room service and a steady diet of self-hatred. Then, a text message appeared on my phone from a number I didn't recognize. "We need to talk. For Sarah's sake. And for mine." It was Emily. My heart lurched, a toxic mix of hope and dread. A part of me, the delusional, sick part, thought this might be an opening. The rational part knew it was a summons, a final, necessary confrontation. She told me to meet her at the city's central public library, a place of enforced silence and quiet contemplation. A starkly ironic choice for the conversation we were about to have. The library was a vast, cavernous space, smelling of old paper and dust, sunlight streaming through the tall arched windows. I found her in the history section, sitting at a long, oak table. She looked tired, her face pale and drawn, the usual spark in her eyes replaced by a deep, weary sadness. She looked at me not with anger, but with a kind of clinical pity, as if I were a strange, unfortunate specimen she was forced to study. There was no warmth, no shared understanding. I was the man who had publicly humiliated her sister by declaring my love for her. I was a monster in her story. I started to talk, the words spilling out of me in a desperate, pathetic torrent. I confessed everything to Hertha, years of silent obsession. The way I had misinterpreted her sisterly kindness as something more. The way I had built an entire fantasy around her in my head. I told her how her laughter, her intelligence, her presence, had become an impossible standard that I unfairly held Sarah to. I tried to explain that my actions at the wedding were the result of a catastrophic internal pressure, the explosion of a man who had lied to himself for far too long. I was begging for her to understand, to see the pathetic human weakness behind the monstrous act. When I was finished, she didn't respond for a long time. She just looked at me, her gaze steady. "Alex," she said finally, her voice soft but incredibly firm, each word precisely chosen. "I have always loved you. I loved you as my sister's boyfriend, as her fiancé, and as the man I thought was going to be my brother. I never, not once, gave you any reason to believe there was anything more. The fantasy you built, the obsession you had, that was all yours. It had nothing to do with me." Her words were not cruel, but they were devastatingly final. She was gently, but completely, dismantling the delusion I had clung to for years. "You didn't just break my sister's heart," she continued, her voice gaining a harder edge. "You humiliated her in front of every person she loves. You turned her into a victim in her own life story. And you used me as your weapon to do it. You have to understand that your feelings for me, whatever they were, are your burden to carry. But you have no right to make them her cross to bear. Stay away from her, Alex. Stay away from our family. Let her heal in peace." She stood up and walked away, leaving me alone at the table, surrounded by books filled with the stories of other people's lives. My own story felt like a tragedy of my own design, and the fantasy that had driven me to ruin was, I finally understood, nothing but smoke. Leaving the library that day, I felt like a man who had been hollowed out. Emily's words, as gentle as they were, had performed a brutal psychic surgery, excising the fantasy I had lived with for years. I was left with only the cold, hard, and undeniable truth. I was the sole architect of my own ruin. There was no one else to blame, not Emily for being kind, not Sarah for not being her sister, not the world for being unfair. My own weakness, my own cowardice, my own profound and selfish dishonesty had brought me to this point. This realization was a new kind of rock bottom, a place below the anger and the shame, a place of pure terrifying self-awareness. It was Chris who pulled me from the wreckage. He showed up at my hotel room that night, his expression no longer one of anger, but of a deep, weary concern. "You can't stay here forever," he said, sitting on the edge of the other bed. "This isn't a life, Alex. This is a waiting room. You need help? Real, professional help. I'm your friend, and I'm not going to abandon you. But I can't fix this. You broke something inside yourself long before you broke Sarah's heart, and you need to figure out what it is. His words were a dose of harsh, necessary medicine. He wasn't offering absolution. He was offering a path, a difficult, painful one, but a path nonetheless. The next week, I had my first appointment with a therapist. Walking into that office was one of the hardest things I've ever done. It was an admission of complete failure, an acknowledgement that I was fundamentally broken. The process was grueling. I was forced to unpack a lifetime of insecurity, of living in the shadow of a more successful father, of developing a pattern of seeking validation from sources outside myself. The therapy sessions were raw and painful, forcing me to confront the ugliest parts of my own character with an unflinching honesty I had never before possessed. I began to understand the why behind my destructive obsession. Emily, being unattainable, was safe. My fantasy love for her required no real vulnerability, no real commitment, no risk of failure. It was a perfect, static thing I could control in my own mind. My real, tangible love with Sarah, however, was terrifying. It required me to be present, to be honest, to be vulnerable, to risk being truly seen and truly known. My act at the wedding wasn't just a confession of love for Emily. It was a catastrophic act of self-sabotage. A subconscious attempt to destroy the real, scary happiness I felt I didn't deserve. This new understanding did not bring peace, but it did bring a sliver of clarity. My personal growth, my long road back to being a decent human being, had to begin with this brutal self-assessment. It wasn't about winning Sarah back, or seeking forgiveness from her family. That was a debt I could likely never repay. This journey was about taking accountability for the man I had been, so I could have a chance at becoming a better one. It was about learning to live with the ghost of my actions, not by ignoring it, but by understanding why it haunted me in the first place. Months bled into one another, marked not by dates on a calendar, but by therapy sessions and small, incremental steps forward. I moved out of the hotel and into a small, sparsely furnished apartment on the industrial side of town. The view from my window was not of parks or glittering city lights, but of warehouses and train tracks, a gritty, honest landscape that suited my new, unadorned life. I sold the house that Sarah and I were supposed to live in, the proceeds of which I sent directly to her via my lawyer, a pathetic, monetary gesture of atonement for a pain that had no price tag. I lived a quiet, solitary existence, my world shrinking to my work, my therapy, and my weekly coffee with Chris. After 6 months of intensive therapy, I felt ready to write the letter. It was not a letter to Emily, whose life I had so unfairly disrupted. It was a letter to Sarah. It took me weeks to write, each word chosen with painstaking care. It was not a plea for forgiveness, or a request for a second chance. It was a confession, a final unvarnished admission of the full scope of my weakness, my delusion, and the unforgivable pain I had caused her. I owed her the truth, not the frantic, selfish truth I had blurted out on the dance floor, but the quiet, reflective, and ugly truth of why I had done it. In the letter, I explained what I had come to understand about myself. I wrote about my fear of true intimacy, my self-sabotage, and the fantasy I had used as a shield against a real, vulnerable love. I made it clear that none of this was an excuse for my actions, but an explanation offered in the faint hope that it might provide her with some small measure of understanding, if not closure. I told her that I knew the damage was irreparable, that I would carry the weight of my betrayal for the rest of my life, and that I hoped, with all my heart, that she could find a happiness that she so richly deserved, far away from the wreckage I had created. Sending that letter was an act of letting go. I sent it through my lawyer to hers, with no expectation of ever receiving a reply. The act of writing it, of articulating my failures without excuse or deflection, was the critical part of my atonement. It was a way of honoring the love she had given me by finally offering her the complete and honest truth, long after it mattered. It was a final acknowledgement of the good person I had destroyed, through my own profound weakness. My relationship with my parents began a slow process of healing, based on my newfound ability to be honest with them about my struggles. My father, seeing me take genuine responsibility for my actions, began to look at me not with disappointment, but with a cautious, hopeful respect. The journey was not about returning to who I was before the wedding, but about evolving into someone new, someone forged in the crucible of shame and self-reflection. It was a slow, arduous process of rebuilding a life, not from scratch, but from the very bedrock of accountability. A year to the day after the wedding that wasn't, I received a manila envelope from my lawyer. Inside were the signed divorce papers, and a short, formal note from Sarah's attorney, confirming that the process was complete. There was no personal message from her. There was only a profound and final silence. That silence was her answer, her verdict, and her right. It was the most painful and necessary consequence of my actions. It was the sound of a door being gently, but irrevocably, closed. I signed the papers, the ink from my pen feeling like a final seal on the worst chapter of my life. I have not seen or spoken to Sarah or Emily since. I occasionally hear things through the grapevine, that Sarah has moved to a new city, that she is doing well, that she is healing. I hope, with a sincerity that is the only clean thing to come out of this mess, that it's all true. I live with the knowledge that I am a ghost in her story, a villain in her past. My atonement is not a single act, but a lifelong commitment to being a better man than the one who stood on that dance floor. The love I felt for Sarah was real, but the man who felt it was not ready, not whole, and in the end, not worthy of it. My friendship with Chris has been rebuilt, slowly and carefully, on a new foundation of brutal honesty. He holds me accountable, and he doesn't let me forget the man I was. As a constant reminder of the man I never want to be again. My life is quiet now. The frantic search for validation has been replaced by a quiet pursuit of integrity. I find a strange, somber peace in my solitude, in the knowledge that I am no longer living a lie. The happiness I once chased so desperately seems like a foreign concept now. My goal is no longer happiness. It is simply to be honest, to be decent, to live a life that causes no further harm. I know that some mistakes are so profound, they can never be truly undone. Some wounds leave scars that never fade. I can never take back the pain I caused, the public humiliation I inflicted on a woman who had offered me her whole heart. I am the man who whispered the unforgivable truth when the whole world was listening. My growth is not about finding redemption in anyone else's eyes. It is about learning to live with myself, to look in the mirror and see a man who is honestly, painfully, and completely aware of the damage he has done, and who has dedicated his life to never being that man again. Every one of us has a secret we're terrified to say out loud, a moment of weakness we wish we could take back. What is the one truth you've whispered, either to yourself or to someone else, that changed the course of your life? We've all been the villain in our own story at some point, even if the microphone wasn't on. Share your story of a mistake that redefined you in the comments below. In these stories of our deepest regrets, we find the universal truth of our shared, flawed humanity. If this story touched you, subscribe for more, and share it with anyone who is on the long, difficult road of trying to forgive themselves.